Level with us, well, it is all about elevations in the reservoirs in terms of the current operations that we do with Lake Powell and Mead. And Whither, Lake Powell, well, Lake Powell I don't think is going anywhere right now. But also if you take the H out, Whither in the Webster's dictionary is defined as become dry and sapless. So we might rearrange the title so it's Whither elevations with us for Lake Powell. So, but that's not going to be on the next slide. So, I would also like to acknowledge, as Steve and James Newberry and Eric did, situation over on the east slope in the Front Range there. Having again operated some of those projects over there, those guys are facing some real challenges, and of course, the folks downstream and on the rivers are facing some real challenges. So, thoughts with them, and it is, as others have noticed or mentioned, a little ironic to be talking about a drought considering the situation there, but it is a different basin, and I think it only enforces some of the comments made earlier about the variability that we see, and that seems to be increasing as well. So, with that, let's see if we can get this to. What I'd like to go through is a little bit of background on how we operate Lake Powell in conjunction with Lake Mead currently. And this is under the 2007 interim guidelines. And then talk about a significant tool that we use to assist in making determinations under the interim guidelines. And then talk a little bit about the interim guidelines themselves. And this is the full title there, by the way, the 2007 Colorado River Interim Guidelines for the Lower Basin Shortages, key point, and coordinated operations of Lake Powell and Lake Mead and how they work. And then go over a little bit of the current projected operations of Powell and Mead for water year 2014, a little recap on 2013 as well. And this just some concerns and notes as far as looking forward. A lot of things to cover here, so this is going to be a pretty high elevation. We like high elevations presentation. And again, we'll acknowledge there are a number of folks here probably in the audience who could do a little bit better job on the background here because they were probably involved in some of the development of the interim guidelines. So deference to those folks, and hopefully they'll bear with me. So a little background on the interim guidelines. Very much appreciate Eric's recap of the Colorado River history, law of the river. This is the sort of latest chapter, if you will, in operations on the Colorado River. Beginning in 2000, as we've all heard, there was facing drought on the basin. And looking at declining elevations and levels in Powell and Mead, those declines were causing concerns and tensions between the basins. As Eric mentioned, the basin, full basin is divided into upper and lower, and then you have the states within the basins under the various compacts that have allocations. Reclamation and water managers noticed and noted that the operational rules for these reservoirs really didn't go over the full range. They didn't address how we would handle severe drought situations. So there was a need to come up with some guidelines and guidance on how to handle situations as we're facing currently, actually. So Interior began a public process beginning in May of 2005 to develop additional operational alternatives that culminated in an EIS in October of 2007, and interim guidelines were signed in December of 2007. So 2008 was the first year we have operated under the interim guidelines. And so we're still learning some things and gaining a lot of experience operating under them. So one of the things I might point out here that's not on the slides, but you'll find it in the interim guidelines, which are included in a record of decision. And I'll have a website address up here. And by the way, you'll see some website addresses through my slides. The last slide I'll leave up there with the questions. We'll also have these websites on, so you don't need to scribble them down, as well as I understand the River District will be putting these presentations on their website for folks. In the actual record decision, and perhaps this was with a rosy view, it was noted that there were several common themes that came out through a consensus. a remarkable consensus developed with common themes of encouraging conservation, planning for shortages, implementing closer coordination of Lake Powell and Lake Mead operations, and preserving flexibility to deal with future challenges such as drought and climate change. And then also implementing operational rules for a long but not permanent, and this is key also, this is an interim set of guidelines to be implemented through the year 2026 to gain experience and then allow folks to see how these may work and how we need to modify them. And then continue to have the federal government facilitate, but again, not dictate, informed decision-making within the basin. So there was a nice statement there on the rod. I think we're doing a pretty good job of that, though I can tell you from conducting several annual operating plan meetings, there's still tension in the basin and there's still different opinions on how to operate. So I want to pause for just a moment here and jump into this 24-month study. Many people have heard this term. It's used a little bit loosely around the water techie or groupie community here. There is both a study model and a report, and unfortunately I and my staff will occasionally just use 24-month study in referring to both of them. The base model, however, is a computer model. It's a deterministic model. It's developed in a program called Whither, and it's to assist Reclamation determining these reservoir operations. There's about 12 major reservoirs, 9 in the upper and 3 in the lower basin, that are modeled through the program, through the model. It's a 2-year projection, hence 24-month study. It's a little bit of a stretch, actually. We actually take it beyond 24 months as necessary to get to the end of a water year, or in the case of the lower basin concerns, the lower basin is on a calendar year where we in the upper basin are on a water year. We will take it to the end of the calendar year to see what the implications of operations may be. So while we loosely call it a 24-month study, it's a little bit more than that. Why 24 months? Well, what goes into that is a series of information and assumptions, principally inflow forecasts from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. There's initially a 3-month forecast that we use as input to the 24-month study. That has a pretty high factor of reliability. Then we use an extended stream flow projection for several months after that, and that's a lower reliability. However, beyond that, we use statistical averages. Well, once you get out 2 years or so, you're starting to see a dampening of the impacts of the operational decision. So taking it beyond 2 years really doesn't provide us a whole lot more information. So hence, again, looking at 24 months is appropriate for what we're trying to do with the decision-making here. It's a monthly time step model, so it doesn't give us daily. It is used to look at what are the monthly releases from the major reservoirs. And also, again, once we get into the interim guidelines, to determine the annual release from Powell down to the lower basin and Lake Mead. So what goes into the 24-month study here? There's about 3 major assumptions: inflows, water use, and operations. So for the upper basin, what that includes is forecasted inflows based on CBRFC again, and then the lower basin, 5-year averages for side inflows. As far as water use goes, the upper basin, the CBRFC forecast actually includes the depletions that happened up in the upper basin. So that's actually implicit in their forecast and included there. For the lower basin, we're looking at the estimated water use of the contractors down in the lower basin, those folks who are taking deliveries primarily out of the lower basin reservoirs of Mead and others there. And then that's also adjusted for things like, and we're going to see a little term here called intentionally created surplus, and then paybacks of those. Those are factors or functions of the interim guidelines as well. So the other thing that goes into the major assumptions or operations on the model be the operations themselves. We have a staff of engineers that run these reservoirs that Steve mentioned, basically Glen Canyon, Fontenelle, Flaming Gorge, the Aspinall units, and Navajo. Each of them looks at their operational guidelines. Many of these are driven by records of decision and environmental constraints, and then also power generation. They look at what are the patterns through the months of the year and the years to see how they're going to operate. That gets input into the model, the 24-month study model. It's run iteratively, and then we see how that pans out for the operations and the elevations of Powell and Mead. We do an official model run basically once a month. It's typically done, and every month it is done, using a most probable, that's a 50% exceedance forecast out of the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. And then several times during the year, basically August, October, January, April, we also do minimum and maximum forecasts. We run the minimum and maximum forecasts we get from CBRFC through the model to give us a range of operations. That gives us a better idea of what may be happening with the reservoir operations as we set them. One of the things in this slide of Hoover there, the bridge is complete, so you can go down there. All of this, of course, is done within state law and decrees and the various records of decision and the law of the river as well. What does the 24-month study report look like? I was going to wave a copy of it up here, but I noticed they haven't handed out binoculars in the back there. So basically what you'll find on our website, and there's a web address right down there at the bottom, is about a 25-page report. The first several pages of that are a wrap-up of current reservoir status, and then sort of a wrap-up of what's happened over the past month with that particular reservoir, and then what's going to be coming on with the upcoming month. And then you'll see a whole series of sheets here, one per reservoir, which basically go over the past history of the operations of that reservoir, inflows, releases, evaporation, power generation, and then the projected, out about 24 months, operations for the reservoir. Towards the end of the report, we also have some sheets that include the major dams' power production and some flood control information there. So if you want to go look at those, again, the website will be up, and it's part of the up at the end here and as part of the presentation. It's a real informative document to see where things are going. There's also, this is part of or on a website that our office runs that has a lot of other operational information that could be very useful to you. So encourage folks to go take a look at that. Moving on to the interim guidelines themselves. What they basically do, and these are the major components of the interim guidelines here, they establish a discrete level of shortage volumes associated with Mead elevations. It's not all about Powell, it's about coordinated operations, it's about encouraging conservation in the upper and lower basin and setting up. The term they use is shortage volumes. I would suggest actually when you get to the shortages, it's not so much a shortage as a let's start conserving in the lower basin. We will be given less than the full allocation out of those reservoirs, so we need to start conserving. So shortage volumes are in there. We'll see some tables here that show what those elevations are associated with shortage declarations in the lower basin. It also provides for coordinated operations of Powell and Mead, again, to better balance the contents there. This is where I'm going to focus on in most of my talk, but additionally in the major components here of the guidelines, you'll see it provides mechanisms to encourage, again, augmentation, conservation through an intentionally created surplus. This is largely used by lower basin contractors to date. And then the interim guidelines, again, are interim. They're supposed to stay in place through the year 2026 to give us some experience and see if we need to modify them in the future. Again, going to the major focus here is the coordinated operation of Powell and Mead. And the objectives of this operation are stated right there in the interim guidelines. It's avoid curtailment of the upper basin uses and minimize shortages in the lower basin, and then not adversely affect the yield for development of available water in the upper basin. So those are real key points in how we look at and operate the system and how the interim guidelines were developed. What does this look like in terms of operating Lake Powell? This is kind of how it works. The interim guidelines established 4 operating tiers for operation of Lake Powell. And there's an equalization tier. This is the top one up here, right up there. And I'm not sure everybody can read this, but when they get the slides, they will have a better shot at it. Basically, in the equalization tier, we're trying to equalize the reservoirs. This is typically going to happen in a very high runoff year or prevent flood spills. And then releases will be down to 8.23 or up from 8.23 million acre feet. The next tier is an upper elevation balancing tier, and this is a tier we spent a lot of time in recent years. In fact, just about all the years, almost all the years since the guidelines were adopted. You'll notice for this tier, the elevation is a moving target. When you go from upper elevation balancing to the equalization tier, there's a moving target there. The idea here is as we go through the years of the interim guidelines, that elevation marches up, so there is less instances where we're in this equalization tier and releasing more water down to the lower basin. There are specific operations within that. They're keyed to what's going on at Lake Mead, as well as just what we're seeing for inflow for Lake Powell. Moving down to the mid-elevation balancing tier, which is the tier we're in this year, and this is a first, and I know people have heard about this. We're looking at releasing 7.48 million acre feet there. Below that, which I hope we do not have to go to, is a lower elevation balancing tier, which releases even less water down there. There's a number of details in how these operate that are right in the guidelines. I don't want to spend too much time on those, but this is a very simplistic view here. These elevations are January 1 of an upcoming year. So when we go through trying to set the operational tier for the coming year, we're going to make a projection of these elevations, and then that sets the tier. Moving on to this table of equalization elevations, as I mentioned, it goes up over time. And again, these are January 1 projected elevations for Lake Powell. Projected using that 24-month study based on the August 24-month study run, actually. And as you can see, again, we are here at 2014, 3648 water year coming at us, and you can see these go up again. So how do we go about setting the tier for operations of Lake Powell, and how do we do it this year? 24-month study is run at the beginning of August. It's run at the beginning of every month, but specifically for the interim guidelines to set the tier, we use the August 24-month study run. We use the August 1st forecast from the Colorado Basin River Forecast Center, as I mentioned. We put in an initial release of 8.23 million acre feet. Why do we do this? This was part of the modeling and the basis for developing the interim guidelines. So that's what is put in there initially to establish what will be, or to project what will be the January 1 elevation for Powell, and then thus establish the tier. Operations of each of the model upstream reservoirs pursuant to their requirements. Again, a lot of these reservoirs have their own requirements on them versus in terms of decrees or records of decision, environmental requirements and flows, as well as power generation. Those are all plugged into the model. The projected January 1 elevations for Powell and Mead are then determined by the model, and then the operational tier is determined by those elevations there. So then you go back to the interim guidelines in that table and the more detail that's actually written in the interim guidelines, and that sets the annual release volume for the upcoming water year. And again, somebody had an earlier slide about water year, of course, is October through September. Once that is done, and in the past, up till this year, it's always been an 823 number that's gone into that 24-month study. However, this year, we ran the 823. It projected that mid-elevation balancing tier, or mid-elevation, balancing tier. And so then you have a 7.48 release. So then you plug that back into the model, and you get the actual projected operations for the upcoming year. Little note here at the bottom. In the upper elevation balancing tier, there is an opportunity in April if the April 24-month study forecast, using the CBRFC's forecast there, if 24-month study projection of Powell's elevation is at or above that equalization level elevation that was in that table, you can actually bump up to operating under the equalization tier. So you can actually end up releasing more than the 823 that would otherwise be released under the upper elevation balancing tier. And in fact, after they put the interim guidelines in place, wouldn't you know it, the first year that's exactly what happened back in 2008. So little challenge for operators there running at the first year. I'd like to jump into the current projected operations of Powell and Mead for water year with a little background here on how did we get here. So what's the current status? As of the end of last month, this is kind of what the basin looked like. We've had dry hydrology, of course. We all heard about that. And looks like Powell's going to be ending up the water year 35 feet lower than last year and 65 feet lower than water year 2011. So what are the volumes? You can see what the volumes are in the percentage of averages. Around half full there, or less. What did the 2013 operations look at? Here's the August 2012 forecast. Again, we run that August 2012 24-month study, project the elevations, project the what the inflows will be. And this is the inflows from CBRFC. You can see the range here, the minimum, most probable, maximum here. That was what we were looking at. This is what it's coming in at. So it's been a considerably dry year. Everybody said this is a 10 and 90 band around the most probable. We all say, oh yeah, 10 and 90, that's pretty safe. You can see we came in underneath. So a little perspective on what the variability in a year can do, and you know, we rely on these forecasts, but we don't always, they don't always pan out. So what is it going to look like for this upcoming year? Here's what 2013 again looked like. Here's what we're projecting for 2014. And even with an 832, and the normal's around 10, that's a 77% of average there roughly. That puts us, given the current storage in Lake Powell, in this mid-elevation balancing tier, mid-elevation operations. So how does this year look compared to other years? All right, so here we have, there's 2002, 1977, there's 2012, last year, way down there, fourth since, and this is since the closing of Glen Canyon Dam. Here's our most probable for the upcoming year, much better than past years. Here's the min probable. Here's the max, and here's that outlier, 2011, that somebody said, geez, why? Well, anomalies. But this is kind of what we're looking at, and this is how it stacks up as compared to the other years we've seen since closure of Glen Canyon. Okay, moving on to what that looks like. And again, here's this operational tier determination that we go through. And quickly here, if you put the 823 into the 24-month study model, you end up below that critical elevation that would put you in the next operating tier. So you put that in the model, you end up below that, you say, okay, we're in the mid-elevation release tier, and then you run the model. Again, well, there's where it puts you, right there in the mid-elevation release tier. And this is the same table we showed earlier, but we've also added in, you can see what happens down at Mead at various elevations. And we'll come back to this and show where Mead's going to be setting. But there's where we're at, and that's a 7.48 release, 7.48 million acre feet release projected then and determined for this upcoming year. So you put your 7.48 back in the model and you say, okay, where are we going to end up? And this is end of calendar year, so again, that January 1. Well, we're right above it. Well, everybody says, well, wait a minute. You just predict you're going to be below. Yeah, but that's the rules. We put the 8.23 in there. We see where it's going to go. That sets the tier. Now you put the real operating tier annual release in there, and you come up with where you're going to be. What about the end of the 2014 water year? So you've got the 7.48 in there, and here's where we project to be at. And you'll notice, and we could go back a couple here, you notice where we started the reservoirs. You look at the content, 39%, 47% difference between Powell and Mead. You move through, and you're going 41, 46, and by the end of the water year, you're looking at 42, 39, much closer balancing. And this was part of the purpose of the interim guidelines, is better balance the contents of these reservoirs. All right, how does that look in terms of a 7.48 release compared to previous releases from Glen Canyon down to the lower basin? This is 65, first major deliveries, full deliveries, and here we are. So for just about all these years, you've had 8.23 or better going down to the lower basin. And essentially what this says is the additional water and unused allocations of the upper basin are benefiting the lower basin here. We're finally in a situation with under the interim guidelines, which started in '08, where we've got to hold some water back here in Powell to balance things out. One of the things I haven't touched on is, okay, this all addresses the annual releases from Powell. How do we determine the monthly releases? This is just a snapshot of what we're looking at for 2014 for the monthly releases. The monthly releases are based on certain demands and mostly power generation, and there's patterns that were in the EIS that we use to apply to the annual release as we go through the year. So this is what it looks like for this upcoming year. Projected operational tiers for 2014 and looking forward to 2015. Again, we're looking at the mid-elevation release tier here for this year. Where could we be in 2015? Well, we could be, and we are projecting at this point, potential for a 7.48 release. And under the most probable, under the probable maximum, could be up in the upper elevation balancing tier with an 11.86 million acre foot release. Or under a minimum, we could be at 7.48. Now, what we're hearing by some of the earlier presenters is we might not face a minimum. That would be really nice. What does that look like graphically? Well, here we are. You look out to January of 2014, and you can see this is the most probable line of operations. We would be just above that mid-elevation release tier, so looking at operating in the upper elevation balancing tier in 2015, possibly. So I mentioned we'd come back to Mead just briefly. With the 24-month study projections for Powell, of course, we do the projections for Mead as well. This is an iterative process between staff in our office up in Salt Lake and the staff in the Boulder city office down in the lower Colorado region. And we pass the model back and forth. They put in their operations, we put in ours. We iterate a few times to make sure the numbers are correct and running well. And then we come up with a projected elevation for, this would be a January 1 of 14 elevation for Mead. So what does that mean to the lower basin? Well, at this point, they're still in a normal operating condition here, normal or surplus operating condition. If they were to fall down below this elevation here, then we'd be talking about shortages. There is a potential for that out into the future. You look at what this may be for Mead's operations. Again, normal ICS surplus condition here. That is projected for next year, but if you take the minimum, you might just skim over it. That's just skimming over that line there. What does that look like graphically? Here's Mead falling down. You're just skimming over that. So if things stay where we projected, should be okay. If not, we could be down in the shortage declaration condition here. So drought continues. We've got some things to address as a whole basin, and certainly in the lower basin as well. So looking forward, these dropping reservoir elevations definitely have impacts and implications to all of us. I really appreciate the comments that Eric made at the beginning, is that if you look at the historic flows, and certainly in recent years from the Colorado River, we as a community, both upper and lower basin, may be using more than is available. What does that mean? Okay, we could have potential triggering of reductions of available and additional triggering reductions of delivery here, and putting in additional conservation, principally in the lower basin. Reduced head on releases from the power units. This is something we don't always think about, but the power generation, certainly in the upper basin of the Colorado River Storage Project Act, funds a number of things, including just the operation, maintenance, and salaries for staff who are operating these reservoirs. We also fund recovery programs for the endangered fish, I'm sure a lot of you are aware of, salinity control program, and again, those operation and maintenance of those facilities. It's a pretty important source of revenue for the upper basin to make sure that we can generate. Just going from 8.23 million acre feet this year down to 7.48 has caused WAPA, Western Area Power Administration, that markets our power. They've indicated to us that's going to cause them to go out and have to buy an additional $10 million worth of power, just dropping that much. So should Lake Powell drop below 3490, you're at minimum power pull. You can't generate below that. We can still deliver water, and that will happen right down to dead storage of 3370. But all of a sudden, that power revenue, and recognize that Glen Canyon Dam's on the order of 75 to 80% of the total crisp generation for the upper basin here. So that would be a significant hit on power as well as revenues from the power. That said, the interim guidelines designed to encourage both states and the basins to step up, conserve, use the water wisely, cut back where necessary. So, as Eric mentioned, we have climate change potentially facing us. Some other folks have addressed that. The CMIP-3, which is the climate modeling done several years ago, analysis, looked at projecting on the order of about 3% reduction in the upper Green River Basin, about a 6% reduction in the upper Colorado above Cameo, and about a 10% reduction in the Gunnison. And that's reductions in runoff to the reservoirs here. So, we've got the interim guidelines, but with climate change, and we're in 14th year of a drought here, it's something we all need to be aware of and to be thinking of how we're going to manage what we're going to receive in the future. So we are in the 14th year of a drought, as has been pointed out, despite this. And I think this is a credit to folks who designed these reservoirs and built them in the past, as well as came up with these interim guidelines and operations. Despite this, we're still at just under 50% full. That's a good thing. It's a really good thing for the basins. Doesn't mean we should give up on or let off on being concerned, but it's still a good thing here. And we do have a process through using the interim guidelines to address managing as we go down in storage and the inflows reduce. So with that, I'd like to wrap up and offer time, if we have any, for questions. And again, here's a series of websites that might be of interest to you that contain either the documents I've spoken of or additional ones. One thing I've neglected to mention here is there's an annual operating plan, and here's another one I can wave at you. It is also, and I mentioned the website for that, on our website. What it is a documentation of how we operate these reservoirs, how we have operated them in the past year, and what the projected operations are for the upcoming year. There's a lot of detail in there. That's another great source if you're interested in seeing how the system, both upper and lower basin, because it addresses both, operates, and understanding better how we make the decisions there. So with that, open up to, all right. Yes? Yeah, the evaporation rates between, I assume, all right, so let's see. Looked at these figures, and in fact, it is in the 24-month study. I think I don't have for Aspinall. Well, I can probably pull this out. Between Mead and Powell, it's typically on the order of about 8 to 9 million acre feet down at Mead on an annual basis, and around 6 up at Powell. Aspinall. Let me take a look. We're looking mostly at Blue Mesa. So I'm looking at numbers at around 6 to 7,000 acre feet for Blue Mesa. So orders of magnitude there with Blue Mesa. Yes?
Thank you. I've often heard Lake Powell referred to as Colorado's savings account, checkings account, against the 10-year rolling average for our required deliveries on the Colorado River. Yet at the same time, there's kind of an overuse of the shares of that water. It's not really piling up in the savings account how it's being drawn down. And so what is the net effect? Should Colorado continue, and the upper basin states, to deliver our required acre feet, but yet the demand continues to grow below? And will that kind of just kibosh the whole plan, because those people will need water in the fire hydrants?
Yeah, that's a great observation. I think, first off, the whole Colorado River Storage Project system, which includes Glen Canyon, Aspinall Units, Flaming Gorge, Navajo, is essentially the reservoirs that were created to allow the upper basin states store water so that they could have it for making their delivery commitment to the lower basin. As Eric mentioned, we have a 1922 compact, divides the basins. We have an obligation under that compact to deliver a certain amount of water. As you can see through that one slide I had, and I'll get back to that, the upper basin is typically over-delivered. That has allowed the lower basin to perhaps use more water, and they have, than is in their allotment under the compact. The interim guidelines are partially designed to get the lower basin back to operating within their compact allotments. So that's where you look at these intentionally created surplus, the shortage provisions. Intentionally created surplus is essentially the allowance to contractors in the lower basin to bank water by conserving certain other places, bank it in Mead or other reservoirs down there, and then deliver it to themselves in times of shortage. But they are facing, shortage declarations. So we have commitments under the compact, but we also have the interim guidelines now to try to get everybody to be working within their compact allotments. And it is system-wide, all the upper stream reservoirs, is essentially a bank account for the upper basin. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah, I'm going to have to, yeah, go, I'm sorry. I'm just saying, some of this is interesting from a hydropower standpoint. Sure. Well, I would hesitate to speak for another agency, and I probably get, this is why I don't wear neckties, because I get pulled off the side here by other agencies when I do. what we understand is, and what Western typically has, is long-term contracts with their customers. When they cannot meet those, then they have to go out on the market, spot market, shorter-term contracts to acquire that power that they don't have available due to operations such as we're facing this year. How they would go about that, I really would like you to talk to Western Area Power Administration about it. I have an office right there in Salt Lake City. Those are the guys, so. Yeah.
What effect does the storage of Mexico's share of water at Lake Mead have on this interim?
Could you repeat the question? I didn't quite hear. If you could get a little closer to the mic. Or,
What effect does the storage of Mexico's share of the water in Lake Mead have on this balance between Powell and Mead?
yeah, it should not have an effect on how we operate under the interim guidelines. There is a recent minute under a treaty, and I'm getting way out of my bounds here, that is looking at allowing them to store some water, but it should not affect the operations of Powell and Mead, is my understanding. So, and there's a great office, our counterparts down in the Lower Colorado region, Boulder Canyon Operations Office, those guys are right on top of that. So if you have specific questions, they also have a very good website, and all the treaties and minutes are up there. In fact, they have a great rundown of the various documents included in the Law of the River. It's a wonderful resource. Other questions?
Thank you, Malcolm.
Great. Sure.